Hello, heretics, and welcome to another episode of Veritas Voices. My name is Lilith Liberated, and I'm here with Renee Velation from Twitter, and we are here to talk about God and godlessness. This week, I decided we needed to talk about something we disagreed on, which was actually harder to figure out than we thought. But Renee had a wonderful idea. Why don't you share it, Renee?
Yeah, the idea that I came up with was that we were to have a little bit of a friendly discussion about the nature of the Genesis account and how it should be read. Should it be interpreted literally? Should it be interpreted figuratively? And all that stuff. I think that's an issue
Absolutely.
it's an issue which I'm not married to, but it's also, I think, an issue which is intriguing and certainly something with which one can agree to disagree, and something which I think is also important.
Absolutely. Now, I'll just preface this by saying I was actually raised to believe in a literal 7-day creation, and taught initially that anyone who didn't take Genesis that way was, compromising the word of God and were, weak or lukewarm Christians, and God would spew them out of his mouth. It's all very dramatic. Christianity likes to be dramatic in an attempt to stay relevant or interesting in any way. But as I grew older and it became clear that that did not reflect reality in any way at all, I came to understand that there were a lot of different denominations that did not require a literal view and that could look at the story as allegory for our choices and for, the state of separation with God and so on and so forth. So my opinions changed, but I have noticed a lot of atheists, usually those who are stuck talking to a lot of really obnoxious evangelicals online, say that you can't not take the Genesis account literally. Like, it's not possible as a Christian. You're just basically taking that same view that the fundamentalists who educated me took, which is, if you don't take it literally, you're not really a Christian. So I guess I wanted to hear that side of it from someone who was never indoctrinated on any of that rubbish. So for that, I'd kind of like to hear your side first, Renee.
Well, what I would say is that you definitely can be a Christian and not take it literally. In fact, I do know many people who self-identify as Christians and who would say, yeah, that's just allegory, or yeah, that's just metaphor. But for me, really, the issue why I think that it should kind of be taken literally is it's not really that it's not really founded upon Genesis chapter 1 to 3 at all. It's more or less founded upon how people like Paul, or even the people in or even other people who quote other stuff in Hebrew, for instance, in Exodus, I think, where it says that God created, you should take Sunday or the Sabbath as a free day, you should honor the Sabbath, because God created the earth in 6 days and the universe. And I think from that you can extrapolate in a way that that even other people, even other writers, took it literally, I think. So I think that's pretty much one of my main reasons why I think that it's correctly interpreted to be a literal account. But again, as I said, I'm not married to that view. I'm completely open to being convinced
and I can
otherwise.
see how someone would need to understand how a Christian could not take it literally, because a big theological part of it was the concept of original sin. If we don't have original sin, why did Jesus have to die? Or original sin is essentially the way of blaming all bad things in the world on us. And a lot of liberal Christians like to pretend that a literal reading of Genesis in that sense was a very modern evangelical phenomenon. And while it has gotten worse in the last century with the evangelicals, it's not new. You just read John Calvin and him mocking anthropologists for setting certain civilizations before the world even existed, in his words. It's clear that he took that timeline literally, and he's not exactly a 20th century evangelical, however much they may take from him. But like, it's impossible to be intellectually honest and believe in a 6,000-year-old Earth and a 7-day creation. Even attempting to put it into, well, maybe the days are eras or whatever, is pretty clearly just desperate flailing. But if you have ever seen the channel Digital Hammurabi, they are actually experts in Sumerian history and a lot of the, the history and things that had a great deal to do with the early writing of the Torah. And they talk about myth as an actual genre. Myth in the sense that the stories were not literally true, but that wasn't the point of them. They were meant to contain wisdom, to portray, broader themes of the human struggle for existence. And I think that may have been initially what the Genesis account was. But at the same time, the way it was set up, again, was to blame us for sin, even though God is supposed to be all powerful. So the way it was used in Christianity does make it a lot more difficult not to take literally, because that's the only excuse they can give for why everything is really our fault, even though God is supposed to be powerful, despite being obviously incredibly impotent.
So one thing which I would say about that is I don't think it can be it can be rationally disputed that the Earth is not 6,000 years old, and that it definitely wasn't. It definitely is the case that the world wasn't created in 6 days. I mean, that's completely ridiculous. I mean, both of us agree on that, but I think what I really get hung up on is, like for instance, when Paul starts comparing Jesus to Adam, like the thing with the first Adam and the last Adam, and also,
as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive.
yeah.
Incidentally, a favorite verse with universalists, who are the more decent Christians who don't believe in a literal or at least a permanent hell.
Yeah.
You might go to hell briefly if you were a jerk, but you get out eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's quite possible that Paul took those entirely literally, and who knows if Jesus even existed. But at the same time, myth being, concerned with broader themes of humanity and the human story could be used in that way, hypothetically. That's the thing. There was the sort of the original intent of the Bible authors. And like, for example, there are the two different creation accounts. But Genesis 2 was written long before Genesis 1. Genesis 1 was put in by the priestly class in Babylon. And they basically just plagiarized it from the Babylonian account, which had 6 great eras wherein different gods ruled over these eras and did different parts of creation. And the 6th divine generation finished up with humanity so the 7th could rest. So I wonder if that was even a part of their culture prior to that, or if they used that to institute the Sabbath as a way to keep people together and practicing. I don't know, but that's certainly possible. So the thing is, yeah, it bothered me because I did understand the theological implications. And when you have when you're raised with, or you see so many people with a very literal-minded view of everything, it's very hard to figure out how a more reasonable, mature person might hold a Christian theology somehow related to the same texts, but bearing very few other similarities. But nonetheless, some people somehow manage it. And honestly, sometimes they are more convincing than others. Sometimes I just feel like they're making excuses. But not so much for the not taking it literally, but just to try and take these very primitive, vulgar ideas and form them into some sort of a transcendent theology. Not an easy task.
I mean, it's like I said, it's certainly possible to be a Christian and to reject like a literal fall or literal Adam and Eve, and because I'm aware that there are many people who do that, but it's I just find it kind of problematic in a way to do that because of, as you said, some implications that it has. Like if there was no Adam, then what did Jesus die for? Like that kind of argumentation, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, and there are two types of people who simplify this. There are the youth pastors and evangelists who are being dishonest to try and rope you in. And there are the more sophisticated theologians who are trying to make this less vulgar than it is. Christianity, I mean. The salesman will say that, sin is just missing the mark. And apparently that word is taken from an ancient term in archery. It's just, it's mistakes. It's mistakes, but they have consequences. And that's why Jesus had to die. Because apparently the consequences of mistakes are horrific death by torture. That's rational. One of the phrases that always stayed with me was listening to Purple Fox's deconversion story on YouTube. The sacrifice of Christ means nothing unless you first believe it should have been you. And that's what the doctrine of original sin is for, is to make you believe it should have been you. Trying to blame this on your own shortcomings that actually exist. We've all done things we regret or made mistakes or hurt someone intentionally or not. It's a little easier to get in with that, but it doesn't have that broader justifying part where you can say, well, because you corrupted the world, but because Adam corrupted the world, our species broke everything. And, we're then responsible for hurricanes and childhood cancer and all that. Yeah, it's pretty fucked up, honestly. But a lot of Christians do it. They do not believe in a literal Genesis. They understand that it, is mythological or a poem celebrating the creation, at least Genesis 1. But then when you get into Genesis 2 and the bit with the snake, again, very mythological. I mean, what every Native American story is like, how did the leopard get the spots? How did the raccoon get the stripes on his tail? And then you have animals doing something silly and, and then they end up with this feature forever. It's exactly like that. How did the snake lose its legs? It told a woman to eat a fruit and God cursed it. So I don't know. It's obviously that kind of story. And yet so much of the core theology has been based on taking it quite seriously. And without the doctrine of original sin, I don't know how you can justify Christianity.
I mean, one thing which I would agree with it certainly also does contain various elements which do read like fiction. Like it has been a traditional human belief that snakes are kind of deceitful and a talking
Mm-hmm.
snake that's also really mythical, and like as you said, like eating a forbidden fruit, or the snake not having legs, the sin being an explanation for that and all that stuff, and that's
Mm-hmm.
also a big part of it. But
Well, and it may have started as that with the Jews, but then when Christians took it, much later, they took a lot from the blood magic of the temple cult and the idea of, sins being atoned for with blood, and turned that into their own theology, quite brutal theology. So yeah, I understand how people have that position, but it means that they also have to rewrite their understanding of salvation and atonement. And a lot of times they'll focus more on the idea of God coming and, experiencing the things we experience so that he could understand them, or, bridging the gap between us, not so much caused by our evil sin because we are so evil, 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 but simply by the difference in our nature as being so, well, inferior, of course. Because remember, you are always inferior to God. Super inferior. Never
yeah,
forget.
yeah. But one question which I would run into that if it's not a literal, if it's just sort of a myth, and if Christian take it that way, is for one question which I would have to ask. Okay, so how did sin come to be a thing? Like, were we
Mm-hmm.
just created from the beginning inherently sinful? In that case, which I also think that the fall of sin essentially leads to, but in that case, they would have to concede outright that we were
It's
just
God's
created
fault.
sinful. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
that
that
is God's fault.
I think it is God's fault either way, but
Of
but
course.
but in that case, you would definitely have to admit that it is God's fault, and that is also problematic from a Christian perspective, at
Oh,
least
certainly.
I think.
Certainly. And it's, as I've mentioned in passing a couple times, that my father has become more liberal in his theology. And he, was talking with me about at one point, and he said, he realized that God had to know when he set things up in the garden that they were going to go that way. He actually still has trouble letting go of a literal Eden, but he has grasped the greater point, because he's not completely intellectually dishonest, that that would be God's responsibility. He is the person who would know what was going on, and have the power to alter things. So this was obviously the plan. Shit plan, obviously, but nonetheless, it's trying to reconcile that is really hard, and I do not envy my dad that job. That is not fun. Makes me
I mean,
sad.
personally, I think the case is quite clear that it is God's fault, and I've written about this extensively, both on Twitter as well as on my blog and all that stuff. But yeah, I think there's no way around it. But as far as Genesis goes, there are, I think, various problematic things, like also the thing about how did God then create the universe if it's just a myth? Like, in that case, the Bible would essentially not have a creation account or a narrative how things came
It
to be.
would have no, and there is a verse my father often quoted from Proverbs that is often used as the excuse for why we need science to actually figure out anything useful, which is it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, and the glory of kings to seek it out. Um, in which case, there's this idea that God had essentially left things for us to figure out, and that's, our natural human curiosity to go out and discover these things is, well, one of our best attributes, and it is. It just tends to lead us away from primitive, vulgar ideas like God. And I know a lot of people will probably take offense at my use of the word vulgar, but Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice based on blood magic. So that's pretty vulgar in my book. Maybe I'm crazy, but I don't think
Yeah.
so.
I mean, one thing which you did say is that science leads us away from God. I do think that's actually accurate because, while many people say that science and religion are non-overlapping magisteria, I don't think that science can disprove theism as a whole, at least not yet. Maybe that will be the case one day, but it at least can rule out the Christian God quite
Oh, for sure.
conclusively, in my
For
opinion.
sure. And that's why more sophisticated theologians have to go further and further into the unknown and the more esoteric and numinous with their concepts of God, which in fairness, you would expect God to fit in those ranges. But at the same time, there's always the tremendous dishonesty of an idea that's not even wrong, where you won't make it falsifiable. In my experience and in my opinion, if you aren't willing to take the risk that your idea is wrong, it's almost certainly wrong. And some part of you knows it. And that's the part that I can't, uh, I can't forgive religion for making us so dishonest and so incurious. That's just infuriating to me. And I think we deserve better.
Yeah, I would also agree with that. I think that religion and especially fundamentalism prevents people from considering other things that might be true. I mean, if you sort of have a belief in a God and you think that he created the universe, and if that belief is fundamental to your identity, then you won't be able, or will at least have difficulty with considering the possibility when a natural mechanism is demonstrated to have been perfectly capable of having created the universe and that stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, the reason that I've commented on so many different areas that I've studied about the origin of different concepts in the Bible and different portions of the Bible is that Christianity is a thing evolved, much as they would absolutely rage to hear me use that, most of them at least would rage to hear me use that description. It evolved. It has evolved. The idea has evolved to survive. And so it's gone through many changes and transitions and adopted, the things that work, just as we do biologically, not because the thing itself was planned to always be like this, but because the ideas that survive, survive, and the ideas that don't, don't. And that's one of the reasons why, people will say things like Mithraism, which was a pretty strong contender to early Christianity, even according to the early church fathers. If things had turned out differently, we might all be worshiping Mithras instead of Jesus. The reason I don't think that's true is that Christianity came from Judaism. It came from that intolerant, exclusive, our God and only our God, and everything else is evil, and we'll throw ourselves on the fire for that. It came from that attitude. And I think in a way that's why it survived and why it succeeded. But I also think that's kind of the worst thing about it.
I also think that, yeah, I think Judaism as a whole is not a great religion. I think Christianity is even worse, with the hell and that kind of stuff. And yeah,
Well, in Islam worse still. I mean, the idea essentially it's like modern Judaism has sort of aged out a lot of the worst of its ideas because it's had to. It's gotten older, and thus, most of the versions currently practiced are not these appallingly evil, fundamentalist, literalist, kill people over beliefs ideas. Um, Christianity has gotten a little farther, but it's still got a lot of horrible ideas that genuinely do kill people. But it is not as frequently with the Crusades and the actual just straight up killing people. It's more death by neglect or death by legislating in ways that, can destroy people's lives. Whereas Islam is still at the point of, just off with your head, or at least many areas of it. And they still actually use that same idea of like God literally creating in 7 days. Islam has possibly more creationist apologists than Christianity. I think they borrow each other's arguments. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, I think one really famous creationist apologist from Islam would be Adnan Oktar. I don't know if you heard of him.
I've heard the name. I haven't been keeping up with his stuff.
I think Adnan Oktar, I think he goes by the alias of Harun Yahya.
Okay, you're gonna have to spell that out. We can put it in the description.
Yeah, I can. There's gonna be a Wikipedia article included of him in the description box. So. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. That'll work because I have no idea how to spell that. Mind you, I'm not good at spelling it the best of times. So, so I don't know. What do you make of more liberal forms of Christianity as an outsider? Have you heard many of their arguments about these sorts of things?
I am not really familiar with the arguments that liberal Christians would give. I am very familiar with liberal Christians themselves being, if I run into a religious person, they most of the time being liberal. I think many people in my surroundings don't really think this whole thing through. Like many of the people in my environment, I don't think even have read the Bible as a whole. But I am not really familiar with some of the arguments, which is why I was so interested in having this discussion with you, because I know that you also have dealt with these people.
Well, any questions as, from someone from your point of view, I could answer about, how different Christians view different parts of Genesis?
Yeah, I would be very interested in hearing about that, if you have any.
Do you have any specific questions, I mean? Renee?
A specific question I would have to ask about this, or which I would want to know is, from the liberal views, do people who hold these liberal views buy into Adam and Eve? And if they do not, how do they sort of explain the fall or our sinful nature, or that stuff?
They don't literally. If you don't buy into the creation account, and especially if you accept any actual science, then it's very clear that no such persons as Adam and Eve existed. But C.S. Lewis, for example, not really all that liberal, but still someone who accepted evolution, he referred to it as an allegory for some, possibly more complex things occurring in prehistory that, the best record of them was to keep the idea going through a more simplified version, a very simplified mythical version, since things were passed through oral history for so long, which, I mean, is at least semi-plausible. He had a concept of like early man as being obviously sort of like God had reached down at some point during our evolution and breathed into us a living soul. And then there was some manner of disassociation or separation, the story of which we don't really get the details of because, like I said, myth and oral history. It's It's an idea that makes a lot of assumptions, and has a lot of unprovable. Yeah, those assumptions are untestable, and that's problematic. But also, some people don't really hold to that concept of the world breaking as sin. They see us more as having to sort of develop and learn here. These tend to be the more touchy-feely types, where, you know, we're just sort of separated from God, like I said, by our nature. And Jesus is God reaching down to sort of understand us and come alongside, which again is more poetic and certainly more reasonable than evangelical Christianity, but that's not saying much. Honestly, with people who don't hold literalist views, they often stick more to the broad themes of God as designer, God as creator, God as a moral source, and they tend to do a great deal of studying to bring the Bible into a more reasonable position. But if you ask them about why they believe whatever it is they believe, they're often referring to other things than the Bible. So it's, I feel like it's people who are better than their Christianity still hooked in by it, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
I think that absolutely makes sense, because I know that there are also many people who, believe in Christianity, and they believe on it based on sort of a feeling, sort of an experience of God, and not necessarily because they have read the Bible through and believe all of the stuff that is written in. There are also no Christians who are not, for instance, hold to the position of biblical inerrancy, which I think is also a big issue. But I think many people just accept Christianity because they have faith, they feel it in their heart, that sort of stuff, but do not base
Which
their
is
belief on the
largely
Bible
based on
itself.
them having experienced it their whole life. So I can see how they would feel it in their heart. I say with snotty quotation marks, as if I never felt that way. But yeah, um, I was just about to say something. I'm sorry. I totally lost my train of thought.
One thing which I also wanted to bring up, sort of as a side note, because what you said earlier kind of reminded me of, I don't know if this would be something that Biologos or any other organization would endorse, but I know at least of one scientist who believes in evolution, but also accepts literal Adam and Eve. And what his position sort of is, the first humans that ever came about, God sort of took two of the humans out of the population and breathed into them sort of the soul, and that's where Adam and Eve, and the rest of the population, they were they're not considered part of us, and we then sort of descended from these two people, from these two first humans who had a soul, which I think is also problematic, and it's completely untestable and completely ad hoc. But that's also.
Oh no, it is testable and obviously false, because you cannot have a population from two people. I don't care how perfect you think the genome is, it just doesn't work. Oh, sorry, I'm face palming. Please go ahead.
And I think that is also not. I think the worst part of it is not that it's not testable and false. I think the worst part about it is that it is clearly ad hoc, and it's clearly a way to rescue the faith at all costs.
Yeah. Well,
in
and
the face of evolution.
that's the imperative. And if people felt free from the necessity to take Genesis, particularly the first few chapters of Genesis, literally, they would be a lot more reasonable. But the thing with biblical inerrancy is the Bible is obviously not inerrant. There is no way to make the Bible inerrant, if you're being honest. So you either have to be purely dishonest and lie about reality. if you ever listen to, look up pastors talking about Bible contradictions and making excuses for them, you will hear some of the wildest justifications you've ever heard in your life. In fact, yesterday I was interviewing someone and he had to look up an Answers in Genesis article for why the Bible says insects walk on 4 legs, which involved a lot of excuses about 2 of their legs really being arms, sort of, sometimes, and yeah, it was all obviously bogus. But that's one option. You can deny reality. The middle option, which is the position of the reasonable Christian, is to deny inerrancy but cling to the concept of inspiration, that God inspired the Bible, but as it says in Jeremiah, the prophecy is subject to the spirit of the prophet, and people couldn't write things that they didn't understand. So, but God still speaks through the word because we still feel things when we read it. The third position is the position that simply looks at the contradiction straight on and says what Bart Ehrman said. Why would I believe God inspired the words when he didn't take the trouble of preserving them? And he didn't. If it's nothing about the Bible or how it was put together is remotely divine in origin or in how it developed. So that's one of many reasons why I think atheism is the most honest position. Because ultimately, reality is what it is.
I would agree with that because obviously I am an atheist and I don't think that you can honestly defend biblical inerrancy. I mean, I've had so many conversations also with Christian apologists and also with who. She who must not be named. And one thing which
she's worse than Voldemort.
Yeah, and I think some of the worst justification I've run into is like one justification which I've heard was I think it was part of Matthew where it says that the devil showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth, which is not possible if the earth is a sphere.
And where he took him to a high place where he could look down and see all the kingdoms of the earth. Yeah.
And one excuse which I've heard for that is that Jesus basically had some form of eagle vision from Assassin's Creed where he could look through the earth and see all the kingdoms on the bottom and that stuff.
Oh, come on. Jesus was, he was a non-useless Aquaman, but let's be honest, he was not as cool as Assassin's Creed. I mean, can we? Hell no. Like in films that are done of Jesus' life, that part, if it's depicted, is usually depicted as Satan giving him a vision of like, look, here's all this splendor, here's all this and that, and sort of like, I guess like a giant tablet, and you swipe through the different biggest, baddest cities on Earth at the time, except without the tablets, just, a hologram or whatever, which, I mean, is the only remaining plausible way. But the text does read like someone who thought, yeah, the earth is flat. And if you go up high enough, you can see enough, because I've noticed that if I climb higher, I could see farther. Ugh. Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why did I ever take this seriously?
It's, I think, further mystery. I mean, I also struggle with the thought that people nowadays can read this book and think, yep, that's from God, because when I've read the Bible for the first time, I was already an atheist, and I, like, many times I've read through it and I laughed out loud because I thought, come on, nobody can take that seriously. But I think,
well, and again, seriously doesn't always mean literally. It could be a parable, but at the same time, yeah. Sprinkling blood on you with a dead bird and shave your head as a cure for skin conditions, no, just no. That is real, by the way. That was one of the things for skinned conditions. They would kill a bird over running water and then dip the other bird in its blood and sprinkle it on you. Oh, and that was also a way to get rid of mold, except they would sprinkle it around your house. Bird blood to get rid of mold and mildew.
Yeah, and then
That's
also you have passages where Jesus is actively advocating against washing your hands, and there are passages about Samson with his magic hair. There are so many things which I think, I don't know if all Christians would take the story about Samson literally, for instance, but the fact that it's in there speaks volumes, and it shows us that it's not really logical or doesn't
well, no, I mean
really make sense.
it's the same mythology as Hercules or Heracles, big badass blessed by God or son of a god, demigod who, has some special trait but is ultimately taken down by their over fondness for women. That's, there's been many a hero story that followed that path. It wasn't always hair, maybe it was Achilles' heel, but it always went that way eventually. So it's clearly, clearly broader mythical themes there, which again, I wouldn't have a problem with if it was just stories like the Ovid and everyone accepted that. But I'd be like, okay, well, that can be another part of mythology in class, and the Jews had these stories and the Greeks had those stories and yada, yada, yada. But that's not what it's taught as. And liberal Christians are often in denial about how many evangelicals are not just teaching these as literal stories, but teaching their children to be terrified of ever thinking of them as anything but literal stories. That's the really scary part to me, because it's so incredibly abusive.
One thing which I do want to say about the Bibles, and this may come as a surprise to some viewers, but I actually like the Bible. I think it's a fun book. It's fun reading it. The stories in it are entertaining. I think the story of Samson I certainly found entertaining, and other stories as well. My problem is not with the Bible. My problem is with the ridiculous position that the Bible is true. That is the
That
real
is an
issue.
untenable position. Absolutely.
If just everyone were to accept, yeah, it's a book. It teaches us about the culture from the past. It gives us some good mythical stories, which we can use for movies like the Exodus movie, which I really enjoyed. Then it'll be all fine. But I'm arguing against the Bible not because I sort of hate the Bible or because I'm against the Bible. It's because people don't recognize the Bible for what it is.
Well, and I can't entirely agree with you, because while there are many good stories, there are also many horrific and incredibly evil stories with terrible morals. Not just the morals of the characters. I mean, the conclusion you're supposed to draw is something terrible. But again, yeah, if it was a book of stories and we could treat it as a book of stories, then we could say that about a single story and we wouldn't be called horrible people who are denying God. Because, we don't appreciate the horrible treatment of the concubine in the story at the end of Judges, that I will say no more about because that might get me kicked off of YouTube. Seriously. Very, very serious story. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's incredibly frustrating, because that's what Christianity does. It gets people to invest their identity in a certain perception of the Bible, not even the Bible itself, but a certain perception of the Bible and a certain attitude about it. Whatever that, group's version might be. I'm sorry, I just find it incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, I also have to agree that obviously there are very, very, very horrible parts in the Bible, which sort of the laws laid out in Leviticus and Exodus and all that stuff, that's horrible, absolutely. But there are also, I think, many stories which I enjoy as myths, or which I enjoy just as stories.
Yeah,
That is
and
essentially
I
my
mean, some of
position.
it is weird. I actually, you know what I really need to do?
But
I need to get high and read Revelations because I think that's the only way to enjoy it. Get really high and read it because that would be hilarious. That book is like being high anyway. It's often been described as John on an acid trip.
yeah, it's a really crazy book. I mean, I don't know when the last time is when I've read it, but when I first read it, I was like, okay, that's weird, I guess.
Well, it is apocrypha, which is a genre we don't really have now. But even still, pretty freaking crazy.
Yeah. But one more thing which I want to say is it's there are many crazy parts in the Bible, and there you can certainly take if you want or if you find necessary, take the first parts of Genesis as a metaphor or as myth, but there are way too many things in the Bible which are too crazy, and it can't all be metaphor, or it can't all be. Yeah,
I admit that the human race would be better off if we did take it all as myth and metaphor. But
I mean, it can't all be metaphor and all be myth, but at the same time still be the word of God. That's my view.
true.
Essence.
Well, I don't know. I've noticed God seems to be pretty incompetent, but I agree with you. I guess that's going to wrap us up today. But I would say if there are any liberal Christians out there who feel I got any of their perspective wrong, feel free to leave a little bit of an expansion in the comments. I know I simplified some things. You have to, in this context at any rate. But if there's anything I actually got wrong, yeah, let us know. So I guess that'll be it for this week. Thanks for coming and listening to us at Veritas Voices. If you have any other questions you would like Renee or myself to answer, leave them in the comments below and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, and you can also reach us on Twitter. The links will also be included below. Uh, Lilith Twitter account is at Lilith Liberated. My Twitter account is at Revelation. And we also have our own Twitter account for Veritas Voices, which will also be included. So
Of course.
if you have questions for the show or any propositions you want to make for us, any suggestions, any ideas, you can always reach out to us and we will be glad to have a conversation.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for. Well, have a great week, everyone, and may reason be with you.